World War I history, as written in textbooks, often carries a solemn, dry gravity. But if one takes a step back and squints, the most tragic events sometimes reveal an absurdity that borders on the comical. World War I is a prime example. This is not a story of monsters and saints, but a tragedy staged by very ordinary men with very human ambitions, fears, and miscalculations. Let us retell this story, not to mock the suffering, but to see the profound irony within this great and terrible drama. Part 1. Pre-war Europe, a not-so-happy family. Imagine early 20th century Europe as a gentleman's club, where everyone wore fine suits, but discreetly hid a dagger up their sleeve. The relationship between the great powers was a complex web of promises, old grudges, and familial envy. The British Empire was the club president, a wealthy gentleman who had been at the top for a little too long. It owned a quarter of the globe and a navy that commanded respect. Britain's primary interest was preserving the status quo, a status quo from which it benefited immensely. It watched its fast-growing German cousin with undisguised annoyance, like an old family business owner eyeing an aggressive startup. The German Empire was the club's newest member, bursting with energy and insecurity. Led by Kaiser Wilhelm II, a man of impulsive temperament and a mustache that defied physics, Germany wanted to be taken seriously. Its industry was booming, its army a formidable machine. But it felt overlooked, a latecomer to the colonial game. It demanded its place in the sun, a phrase that sounded poetic, but was, in fact, a demand for an empire of its own. France was still nursing its wounds from the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. The loss of Alsace-Lorraine was a scar that never healed. An entire generation of French politics was built on the idea of revenge. Patiently, it rebuilt its army and sought allies, waiting for the day it could reclaim what was lost. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was like a magnificent old palace with a crumbling foundation. It was a patchwork of a dozen nationalities: Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Croats, Serbs, most of whom no longer wanted to live under the same roof. Keeping the empire from disintegrating was a full-time job for its aging emperor, Franz Joseph. Its greatest fear was the rise of Slavic nationalism in the Balkans, backed by their big brother, Russia. The Russian Empire was a contradictory giant. It possessed a colossal population and vast resources, but its industry and political system were backward. Tsar Nicholas II was a devoted family man, but a weak ruler. Russia saw itself as the patron of the Slavic peoples, and was constantly seeking to expand its influence toward the Balkans and the Mediterranean, putting it on a collision course with Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. To ensure their security, these nations formed two major alliance blocs. Like two rival sports teams, always ready for a brawl. The Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Triple Entente, France, Russia, and later Britain. In theory, these alliances were meant to be a deterrent. In reality, they functioned like an intricate system of tripwires. If one was triggered, the entire system was designed to explode. Part 2. The shots in Sarajevo, when a small event ignited a great fire. On June 28, 1914, in Sarajevo, a young Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip assassinated the Austro-Hungarian Archduke Franz Ferdinand. At its core, it was an act of terrorism by an extremist group. But in the tense atmosphere of 1914 Europe, it was far more than a simple criminal case. For Austria-Hungary, this was the perfect pretext to solve its Serbia problem once and for all. It believed, without clear evidence, that the Serbian government was behind the plot. But to attack Serbia, it needed the backing of its powerful friend, Germany, and Germany gave Austria-Hungary a blank check, a promise of unconditional support. Why? German leaders feared that if they didn't act decisively, their only reliable ally, Austria-Hungary, would weaken and collapse. They also gambled that the conflict would remain a localized Balkan war. It was one of the most catastrophic miscalculations in history. Austria-Hungary sent Serbia an ultimatum with humiliating terms, designed to be rejected. To everyone's surprise, Serbia accepted almost all of them, quibbling over only minor points. But Vienna's mind was made up. On July 28th, it declared war on Serbia, and so the dominoes began to fall. Russia, as Serbia's protector, ordered a general mobilization of its army. Germany saw Russian mobilization as an act of war. It demanded Russia stand down. Russia refused. Germany declared war on Russia. Since France was Russia's ally, Germany knew a French declaration of war was inevitable. Germany decided to execute the Schlieffen Plan, defeat France quickly by invading through neutral Belgium, then turn to face the lumbering Russian army. The violation of Belgian neutrality gave Britain the reason it needed to enter the war. It declared war on Germany. Within a week, through a series of what seemed like logical and necessary decisions to the men making them, all the great powers of Europe were engaged in a total war whose consequences none of them truly foresaw. The promise to be home by Christmas quickly became a bitter joke. Part 3. Trench Warfare. The Great Senseless Siege. The German plan for a lightning victory in France failed on the outskirts of Paris. The war of movement quickly ground to a halt, replaced by something new and horrifying: trench warfare. From Switzerland to the Belgian coast, the two sides dug a complex system of defenses, turning the Western Front into a barren no-man's land. The war became a colossal siege, where the goal was not to defeat the enemy in a decisive battle, but to bleed him dry of men and material. Life in the trenches was a subterranean existence of mud, rats, and the constant presence of death. The bravery of the common soldier was undeniable, but it was often squandered in futile attacks. Generals trained for the wars of the 19th century applied old tactics to a new reality. Going over the top, climbing out of a trench to advance toward enemy machine guns, became a repeated, suicidal ritual. Technology had outpaced tactics. The machine gun, heavy artillery, and later poison gas made defense infinitely stronger than offense. Great battles like Verdun and the Somme in 1916 became meat grinders. where hundreds of thousands of lives were sacrificed for a few square kilometers of blasted earth. It was a war of attrition, a contest of which side could endure the most horrific losses for the longest. Part 4. The World at War. The conflict was not confined to France. On the Eastern Front, the fighting was more mobile, but no less brutal. The massive, but poorly equipped and supplied Russian army suffered devastating losses against the Germans. The Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers, opening new fronts in the Middle East and the Caucasus. An Allied attempt to knock them out of the war at Gallipoli ended in a disastrous failure, leaving a deep scar on the national psyches of Australia and New Zealand. The war was also fought on the oceans, with a British naval blockade of Germany and a German counter-blockade using submarines, U-boats. The U-boat policy of sinking all ships, including civilian vessels, caused outrage around the world, particularly in the United States. Part 5. American Entry and the Endgame. 1917 was the pivotal year. In Russia, exhaustion from the war led to the February and October revolutions. The Bolsheviks seized power and signed a separate peace with Germany, pulling Russia out of the war. This allowed Germany to transfer vast numbers of troops from the east to the west for one final, decisive blow. However, Germany's own submarine strategy finally drew the United States into the conflict. Coupled with the revelation of the Zimmermann telegram, a German proposal for Mexico to attack the US, President Woodrow Wilson had his reasons to declare war. The entry of America, with its nearly limitless industrial and human resources, tipped the balance of power. Germany's 1918 spring offensive, though initially successful, could not be sustained. The German army was spent after 4 years of war. The Allied counteroffensive, bolstered by fresh American troops, pushed the Germans back across the front. Germany's allies began to collapse. Facing military defeat and revolution at home, the German High Command was forced to seek an armistice. At 11 a.m. on November 11, 1918, the guns fell silent. The war was over. But making peace would be another matter entirely. Part 6. The Bitter Peace and the Ironic Legacy. The Treaty of Versailles was not a document of reconciliation, but a victor's peace imposed upon the vanquished. France, represented by Prime Minister Clemenceau, wanted to ensure its security by permanently weakening Germany. Britain, represented by Prime Minister Lloyd George, wanted to punish Germany, but not to the point of economic collapse. A stable Germany was a good trading partner. The United States, with President Wilson, brought lofty ideals of self-determination and an international body, the League of Nations, to prevent future wars. In the end, the French view largely prevailed. Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for the war, lose territory, disarm, and pay crippling war reparations. The treaty created a fragile peace. It left a legacy of humiliation and bitterness in Germany, providing fertile ground for extremist movements. It redrew the map of Europe, but created as many new minority problems as it solved. Ironically, the war to end all wars directly sowed the seeds of a far more terrible conflict just 2 decades later. World War I remains a stark reminder that patriotism can curdle into blind nationalism, that defensive alliances can become engines of war, and that decisions made in elegant offices can lead to the deaths of millions in muddy fields. It was the ultimate tragedy of miscalculation. Thank you for watching.